Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that everything you thought trapped you was actually protecting you from yourself. The alarm clock that felt like a prison sentence, the routine that seemed to drain your soul, the compromises that made you feel like you were dying inside. Gone. All of it. And suddenly, you're standing in an empty apartment staring at walls that echo when you speak, and for the first time in years, maybe decades, you can actually hear yourself think. This is the moment most men discover after divorce. Not freedom from their wife, freedom from the person they became to keep the peace. Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher who understood human suffering better than almost anyone who ever lived, said something that destroys the Disney fantasy we're all sold. He said marriage demands that a man surrender his individuality to become what someone else needs him to be. And for most men, that surrender happens so gradually, so imperceptibly that they don't even notice they're disappearing until the divorce papers arrive, and suddenly they're forced to remember who they were before they became someone's husband. The man who loved playing guitar at 2 a.m. The man who would drive 3 hours just to watch the sunrise from a mountain. The man who read philosophy instead of watching television. The man who had opinions that weren't filtered through someone else's approval. That man didn't die. He just went into hibernation. And divorce is the brutal awakening that brings him back to life, gasping and disoriented but undeniably alive. Now here's what makes this so devastating and so liberating at the same time. Most men don't realize how much they've compressed themselves until the pressure releases. They don't notice how many desires they've buried, how many dreams they've postponed, how many parts of themselves they've quietly killed to avoid conflict, to maintain harmony, to keep someone else happy. They think they're being good husbands. They think they're being mature. They think they're doing what love requires. But Schopenhauer saw through this illusion completely. He understood that what we call love is often just mutual need wrapped in romantic language. That what we call compromise is often just gradual self-erasure. That what we call partnership is often just two people slowly suffocating each other with expectations neither of them can meet. And the man who discovers this after divorce, standing alone in his new reality, experiences something that people who've never been through it cannot possibly understand. He experiences grief and relief simultaneously, mourning for what's lost, and celebration for what's possible, pain at the ending and excitement at the beginning. This is the paradox that breaks most people's brains when they try to understand post-divorce freedom. From where you're watching this right now, in whatever city you're experiencing this moment, you might be thinking this sounds cold, cynical, even cruel. How can divorce be freedom when it represents failure? How can being alone be better than being partnered? How can losing your family be anything other than tragedy? And those questions make perfect sense if you still believe the narrative society sold you about what marriage is supposed to be. But Schopenhauer invites you to question that narrative entirely. He asks you to consider whether the institution of marriage, as it's currently constructed, actually serves human flourishing or just social stability, whether it creates genuine connection or just acceptable imprisonment, whether it produces authentic love or just elaborate performance. Think about the married men you know. Really think about them. How many of them seem genuinely alive? How many of them still have that spark of individual vitality that makes a person interesting? How many of them pursue passions that have nothing to do with their family obligations? How many of them have conversations that aren't just logistics and planning? How many of them seem to actually enjoy their lives rather than just endure them? Schopenhauer would say very few. He'd say most married men are living in what he called a state of resigned suffering. They've accepted their diminishment as the price of companionship. They've traded their authenticity for stability. They've sacrificed their individuality on the altar of social acceptability. And they tell themselves, this is maturity, when really it's just slow spiritual death. But here's what happens when divorce shatters that compromise. The man who's been living small suddenly has space to expand. The man who's been quiet suddenly has permission to speak. The man who's been contained suddenly has room to explore. Not because his ex-wife was evil or oppressive, though sometimes that's part of it, but because the entire structure of married life, with its expectations and obligations and unspoken rules, kept him in a box he didn't even realize he was in until the box broke open. This is why post-divorce freedom feels so disorienting. It's not just that your schedule changes or your living situation shifts. It's that you suddenly have to rediscover who you are when nobody's watching, when nobody's expecting anything, when nobody's needs are shaping your choices. And most men haven't been that person in so long they don't even know where to start. Schopenhauer predicted this exact phenomenon. He said that men who marry young sacrifice their potential for development because they become focused on providing and maintaining, rather than growing and exploring. They lock themselves into identities before they've fully formed. They commit to being husbands and fathers before they've discovered what kind of men they want to be. And then decades pass. The children grow. The passion fades. The conversations become transactional. And underneath all the responsibility and routine, there's a man who never got to fully become himself, who never got to test his limits, who never got to find out what he was actually capable of when freed from other people's expectations. Divorce doesn't create this man. Divorce reveals him. It strips away the performance and exposes the person who's been waiting beneath it. Sometimes that person is broken, damaged, lost. But sometimes that person is powerful, creative, vital in ways that marriage never allowed him to be. Here's what Schopenhauer understood about human nature that most people never grasp. We're not designed for permanent partnerships the way society insists we are. We're designed for periods of intense connection, followed by periods of necessary solitude. We need time with others and time alone. We need relationships and we need independence. We need intimacy and we need autonomy. But marriage, especially modern marriage with its ideal of constant togetherness and complete merging, doesn't allow for this rhythm. It demands consistency instead of cycles. It requires you to be the same person every day instead of allowing you to evolve. It insists on shared everything when sometimes you need things that are only yours. And men, particularly men who've internalized the provider role, often feel this constraint most acutely. They're expected to be stable when they feel chaotic. They're expected to be strong when they feel uncertain. They're expected to have answers when they're full of questions. They're expected to be finished products when they're still works in progress. Marriage doesn't give them space to figure this out. Divorce forces them to. And this is where the real freedom begins. Not in the absence of relationship, but in the presence of choice. The divorced man wakes up on Saturday morning and realizes nobody cares what he does today. He can go to the gym or stay in bed. He can eat breakfast or skip it. He can call friends or sit in silence. He can pursue a project or do absolutely nothing. For the first time in years, his time is actually his. And this sounds trivial until you've experienced years of negotiated schedules, coordinated calendars, plans that require approval, activities that need discussion. The weight of constant consideration for someone else's preferences, someone else's comfort, someone else's mood. It's not that caring about your partner is wrong. It's that when every single decision requires consultation, you lose touch with your own instincts. You forget what you actually want because you're so accustomed to filtering everything through what someone else wants. Schopenhauer called this the dissolution of will. When you become so entangled with another person's desires that you can no longer distinguish your own. When you've compromised so much for so long that you don't even remember what you'd choose if the choice was purely yours. And post-divorce freedom is the violent reclamation of that will. The rediscovery of your own preferences, your own rhythms, your own way of being in the world. Some men handle this terribly. They spiral into excess, trying to make up for lost time through extreme behavior. They date frantically, spend recklessly, party desperately, trying to fill the void with noise and novelty. These are the men who give divorce a bad name, who seem to prove that freedom just means irresponsibility. But other men, the ones who do the difficult internal work, discover something profound. They discover that freedom isn't about doing whatever you want whenever you want. It's about finally having the space to figure out who you actually are beneath all the roles and expectations and performances. These men start small. They cook meals they actually enjoy instead of meals that accommodate everyone. They listen to music that moves them instead of background noise that offends no one. They read books that challenge them instead of scrolling mindlessly through content. They pursue interests that have nothing to do with being marketable or productive or impressive. They remember what it feels like to be curious about something just because it interests them. not because it serves some larger purpose. This is the freedom Schopenhauer valued most. Not freedom from responsibility, but freedom for authenticity. Not freedom to be reckless, but freedom to be genuine. Not freedom from connection, but freedom from false connection. From relationships built on need and habit rather than genuine appreciation. And here's what happens to men who embrace this kind of freedom. They become more interesting, not less. More capable of real intimacy, not less. More attractive to potential partners, not less. Because they're no longer performing. They're no longer trying to be what they think someone else wants. They're no longer suppressing parts of themselves to avoid conflict. They're just being who they actually are. And that authenticity is magnetic in a way performance never can be. But this transformation takes time. The first months after divorce are usually chaos. Grief mixed with relief. Freedom mixed with fear. Excitement mixed with profound loneliness. Most men oscillate between thinking divorce was the best thing that ever happened to them and thinking it was the worst mistake they ever made. This is normal. This is necessary. Because you're not just losing a relationship. You're losing an entire identity. You're losing the story you told yourself about who you were and what your life meant. You're losing the future you thought you were building. You're losing the version of yourself that existed in relation to another person. And rebuilding from that loss requires you to sit with uncertainty in ways most people never have to. You have to tolerate not knowing who you are for a while. You have to accept that you're going to make mistakes as you figure things out. You have to be patient with yourself as you rediscover preferences you forgot you had, and develop new ones you never knew were possible. Schopenhauer would say, "This is where philosophy becomes practical. This is where ideas about authenticity and freedom and individual will stop being abstract concepts and become daily practices. This is where you learn whether you actually have the courage to be yourself, or whether you're just going to find another relationship to hide in, another person to blame for your lack of fulfillment, another external structure to avoid taking responsibility for your own happiness." Most divorced men eventually remarry. They find someone new, rebuild, try again. And there's nothing wrong with that if they've done the internal work first. If they've used their freedom to become someone worth being in relationship with. If they've developed a strong enough sense of self that they can be partnered without being consumed. But many don't. Many rush back into relationship because freedom is too uncomfortable. Because being alone with themselves is too confronting. Because they'd rather have the familiar constraints of partnership than the terrifying possibility of actually becoming who they could be. And these men miss the entire point of post-divorce freedom. They treat it as an intermission between marriages, instead of an opportunity for transformation. They waste their freedom on distraction, instead of using it for development. They get divorced again, often for the same reasons because they never learned the lesson the first divorce was trying to teach them. Here's that lesson in Schopenhauer's terms. You cannot find yourself in another person. You can only lose yourself. You cannot complete yourself through relationship. You can only fragment yourself. You cannot become who you're meant to be while constantly accommodating someone else's vision of who you should be. The freedom most men discover after divorce isn't the freedom to do whatever they want. It's the freedom to finally stop running from themselves, to stop hiding behind roles and responsibilities, to stop using relationship as an excuse for not developing their potential, to stop blaming their circumstances for their lack of fulfillment, and to start building a life that actually reflects who they are, instead of who they think they should be. This is uncomfortable. This is difficult. This is why most men avoid it even when divorce hands them the opportunity. Because it's easier to blame your ex-wife for your unhappiness than to admit you were never happy to begin with. It's easier to say the marriage failed than to admit you failed to show up as yourself. It's easier to rush into something new than to do the hard work of becoming someone worth being. But the men who do this work, who use post-divorce freedom as an invitation to authentic self-discovery rather than just an escape from responsibility, these men often describe their divorce as the best thing that ever happened to them. Not because they hated their ex-wife, not because marriage is terrible, but because divorce forced them to finally meet themselves, to finally stop performing and start living, to finally discover what freedom actually means. Schopenhauer spent his entire life arguing that most human suffering comes from wanting things to be different than they are, from resisting reality instead of accepting it, from clinging to illusions instead of seeing clearly. And marriage, for many men, becomes the ultimate illusion. The belief that partnership will complete them, that love will save them, that commitment will give their life meaning. Divorce shatters that illusion violently and completely. And in the wreckage, if you're brave enough to look, you'll find something more valuable than any relationship could ever give you. You'll find yourself. The question isn't whether divorce represents failure. The question is whether you have the courage to use that failure as a beginning instead of an ending. Now here's where most people get this completely wrong. They think post-divorce freedom means living selfishly, thinking only about your own needs, becoming some kind of isolated hermit who rejects all human connection. That's not what Schopenhauer advocated at all. What he understood, what most people miss, is that you can't genuinely connect with another person until you've genuinely connected with yourself. You can't offer authentic love until you know who's doing the offering. You can't build a real partnership until you've built a real self. And most men enter marriage without having done any of this work. They go from their parents' house to college to their wife's house, without ever spending significant time alone, without ever developing a coherent sense of self that isn't defined by external relationships. They become husbands before they become men. And this creates a foundation problem that no amount of couples therapy or communication techniques can fix. Because the issue isn't how you relate to your partner. The issue is that you don't know who you are outside of being someone's partner. Divorce forces this reckoning. It strips away the identity scaffolding and leaves you naked with yourself. And most men experience this as terrifying at first. The silence of an empty house, the absence of someone to consult before making decisions, the strange feeling of eating dinner alone, sleeping alone, existing alone. But gradually, if you don't rush to fill the void with distraction or a new relationship, something shifts. The silence stops being oppressive and starts being peaceful. The solitude stops being lonely and starts being liberating. The independence stops being scary and starts being empowering. You begin to notice things about yourself you never noticed before. The way your energy flows when it's not being redirected to manage someone else's emotions. The interests that emerge when you're not defaulting to shared activities. The rhythm of your days when they're structured around your own needs rather than compromise. And this is where the real discovery happens. You start to realize that many of the things you thought were essential to your happiness were actually just habits. Many of the preferences you thought were yours were actually accommodations. Many of the desires you thought were authentic were actually inherited from someone else's vision of what your life should look like. Schopenhauer called this awakening, the recognition of will. The moment when you stop living reactively, according to external pressures and expectations, and start living according to your own internal truth. And here's what's fascinating about men who go through this process genuinely. They don't become bitter about their marriages. They don't resent their ex-wives. They don't regret the years they spent partnered. Instead, they develop a kind of philosophical acceptance. They recognize that the marriage served its purpose for a time, that it taught them things they needed to learn, that it showed them aspects of themselves they needed to see. But they also recognize that staying married would have prevented them from becoming who they're meant to be, that the relationship had reached its natural conclusion. That holding on would have been an act of cowardice, not commitment. This perspective is rare because it requires you to hold two truths simultaneously: that your marriage mattered and that ending it was necessary, that you loved your partner and that love wasn't enough, that you gave it genuine effort and that effort couldn't overcome fundamental incompatibility. Most people can't handle this complexity. They need their divorce to be someone's fault. They need their ex to be a villain. They need their decision to be justified by the other person's failures. But the men who discover real freedom after divorce don't need this narrative. They can acknowledge their own part in what didn't work. They can appreciate what was good while accepting what was impossible. They can wish their ex-wife well while being grateful they're no longer together. This emotional maturity is actually what makes them ready for genuine connection again, if they choose it. Because they're no longer looking for someone to complete them or save them or give their life meaning. They're looking for someone who appreciates who they already are, someone who adds to their life rather than defines it, someone who enhances their freedom rather than constrains it. And this completely changes the dynamic of relationship. Instead of two incomplete people trying to become whole through merger, you have two whole people choosing to share their lives. Instead of two people losing themselves in each other, you have two people maintaining themselves while building something together. Instead of dependency disguised as love, you have genuine appreciation and respect. Schopenhauer would say, this is the only kind of relationship worth having. One built on mutual recognition rather than mutual need. One that expands both people rather than diminishing them. One that honors individual freedom while creating shared meaning. But you can't build this kind of relationship until you've discovered who you are outside of relationship. Until you've proven to yourself that you can be happy alone. Until you've developed a life that's satisfying enough that partnership becomes optional rather than necessary. And this is why post-divorce freedom is so valuable. Not because being alone is better than being partnered, but because knowing you can thrive alone transforms how you show up in partnership. You stop being desperate. You stop being clingy. You stop being willing to compromise essential parts of yourself just to avoid being single. You become someone who chooses relationship consciously rather than someone who clings to it desperately. And that shift changes everything. The men who discover this don't fear being alone anymore. They don't measure their worth by whether someone wants to be with them. They don't organize their entire existence around maintaining a relationship. They build lives they actually love. Lives that reflect their values, their interests, their authentic selves. And then, if the right person comes along, they invite them into that life. But they don't rearrange their life to accommodate that person. They don't abandon themselves to keep that person. They don't shrink themselves to make that person comfortable. They remain who they are, and they partner with someone who appreciates that, not someone who demands they become someone else. This is the freedom Schopenhauer understood. The freedom to be yourself fully, to live according to your own truth, to build a life that reflects your deepest values. And for most men, divorce is the catalyst that makes this freedom possible. Not because marriage is inherently bad, but because most marriages trap men in performances of themselves rather than expressions of themselves. Write in the comments right now the first thing you're going to reclaim about yourself. That part of you that went silent, that dream you postponed, that version of yourself you've been waiting to become. Put it in writing, because that makes it real. And when you see other men doing the same thing, you'll realize you're not alone in this discovery. You're part of a movement of men waking up to their own potential. After you comment, subscribe to this channel because you're clearly someone who values truth over comfort, someone who's ready to question the narrative society hands you, someone who understands that real growth requires facing uncomfortable realities. The like button is right there, and clicking it tells the algorithm that this perspective matters, that men need to hear these truths, that we're done pretending everything is fine when so many of us are slowly dying inside our own compromises. Keep watching because the next video explores something even more unsettling. Something about human nature that explains why most people never discover the freedom that's available to them, why they choose comfortable imprisonment over uncomfortable liberation. The journey you're on doesn't end with understanding divorce. It's just beginning. And everything you thought you knew about happiness, success, and fulfillment is about to be challenged in ways you can't even anticipate yet. Stay with this exploration because you're finally ready to see what most people spend their entire lives avoiding.